Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you, as always. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about all things to do with relationships. Today, Matt, is the second in a short series on neurodiversity. We're going to look today at autism. I think before we get into the way that autism manifests itself in relationships and the strengths and challenges of autism, let me set the scene in terms of why we want to talk about it, really. But a big part of it is that the number of diagnoses is going through the roof, right? That I think about one in 35 children in the UK is now diagnosed with some form of autism. That's gone up by about 800% in the last 20 years. The male-female ratio has shrunk a lot too. It used to be about 4-1, whereas now it's 2-1. So increasingly, a lot more girls and women are being diagnosed with autism. And I think that spike in diagnoses has really been driven a bit like what we were talking about with ADHD in the last episode. The spike in diagnoses has been much more at the milder end of the spectrum, which it's that element of neurodiversity, both with ADHD and with autism. It tends to find its way into our consulting rooms, isn't it? Into our work and into the sorts of couples that come and see us. Partly because individuals might not have had a diagnosis in the first place. So they might be trying to work out what's going on for them as an individual and in their relationship. But also on social media, you see it a lot, don't you? You see people almost celebrating autism as, like you were saying with ADHD last time, bit of a superpower, bit of something that they attach to their sense of identity in the world. And we see a lot of that too. So I think we're talking more today about that milder end of the autism spectrum, which tends to manifest itself in terms of social communication and interaction problems, but then also some restrictive or repetitive interests and behaviors. We can unpick and unpack a bit more of that, but
Yeah.
how do you see it mainly in terms of your day-to-day life, but also in relationships in your work with couples?
Yeah, I guess just to echo what you're saying there, in my day-to-day life, actually, lots of autism around me in the school that my boys go to, and family and friends. And some of that are like really at the sharp end, really profound manifestations, and coupled with difficulties with acquiring language and intellectual difficulties as well. So like really kind of sharp manifestation of it, which I suppose partly informs my response when people say they're autistic or a bit autistic, or young people say to me they've got a touch of the tism or something, and it's like, I get it, it's light-hearted, we don't have to be terribly po-faced about it, but
What do you
yeah.
think they mean when they say things like that? Are you talking kind of they get a bit tired after social interactions? They might get really, really focused on narrow interest. They might be really interested in something, or
Yeah. Yeah.
might struggle with eye contact, things like that. Just
Yeah.
things that a lot of people struggle with. A bit of social anxiety can feel a little bit like some minor
Yeah,
manifestation of
sort of
autism, can't
rigid, would be another thing, wouldn't
it?
it?
Rigid,
Not
yeah,
liking plans changing,
yeah.
those sorts of things, I think is what people mean. And you can probably, I think almost all of us could pick out aspects of it and say that applies to me, or in certain circumstances that applies to me. Sort of overwhelm it on big social occasions, like definitely something I would feel, but I wouldn't identify myself anywhere near a spectrum. But I would say social gatherings deplete my energy, leave me feeling exhausted. If you married that up with 6 or 7 other symptoms, then you might be talking about something that might register on a spectrum. I think that is the thing to say about autism, isn't it? It genuinely is a spectrum condition. So even if you're touching like the milder end of it, you're a long way from the sharp end. Called autism spectrum disorder for a reason, right? Lots of different manifestations of it. In my clinical work, I see people who would register at the mild to moderate end, and often don't have a diagnosis, and some do. And I think it's a very is something that you, I think, pick up on in individual work and in couples work as well. I think there are some of those markers we're talking about really do show up in relationships where you've got that kind of back and forth, and you're trying to read subtle cues, and sometimes things need to be expressed in a certain way for them to land. And sometimes the communication patterns for autistic people are quite direct, quite literal, and that will be one of the ways in which I think it can rub in a relationship.
Yeah, and rub both ways in the sense of not. But I was reading a little bit while preparing for the podcast discussion today about the double empathy gap. The idea that we often focus on the person who is autistic and their difficulties in understanding verbal or social cues and struggling to identify what's going on
Mm.
with their partner, for example. But it can work the other way, right? That if you're in a relationship with someone with an autism diagnosis, it can be potentially quite difficult to work out what's going on for them. And
Yeah.
that ability to kind of communicate and connect with each other is something that I think couples therapy can really help with.
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered whether you'd seen the Love on the Spectrum show, the TV show.
No.
It's quite fun watch. I mean, people have been critical of it insofar as, there's a risk that it infantilizes, some of the people that it's showcasing. But it's really a sweet program, and some of the people who participate in that program are quite, they're not at the mild and moderate end of autism from most people's point of view. It's partly the nature of a TV show, isn't it? If you promise love on the spectrum and you promise the opportunity to view the world through people, through the eyes of people who are autistic, then you've got to show autistic people with pronounced characteristics, so they have those pronounced characteristics. And it's quite an intriguing kind of watch as you see them in, one of the most excruciating and difficult social environments, I suppose, that first date. So I didn't want to take love away from a whole group of people who are at the, moderate to more severe end, because the show is also genuinely, quite heartwarming as well.
Do they get paired up with other people with a diagnosis, or does it
They
be
do. They
intimately?
do. That's really the function of the show, and the thing that's probably, I think you've already pointed it out, but the thing that's worth pointing out, like that could work in that situation. I think what you and I are seeing quite often is two people who've gotten together in, following university, at university, in work, those kind of things, and it turns out one of them would probably qualify for a mild diagnosis, or would have aspects of their personality that, mirror those kind of symptoms we've been
But
talking.
that's definitely what I see. Definitely more what I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Um,
worth pointing
um,
out as well, I guess, that it's a neurodevelopmental issue, right? It's something about the way that the brain works. And like we were talking about with ADHD, there's something there about the cementing of ways that the brain works. And in terms of change or in terms of expectations in a relationship, it's worth us kind of teasing out what that means for a relationship as
yeah.
well.
I was thinking of another example that we didn't talk about, which would be something like this kind of sensory sensitivity
Yes.
that
Yeah.
by autism. So things like touch and sound and smell, all of those things can be overwhelming. And obviously, in a typical relationship where there's a kind of physical exchange back and forth, there's intimacy, that's not necessarily straightforward either. So, giving physical attention, affection to somebody, and then receiving it, those things can go wrong. Signs and, cues can be misread, and, a withdrawal or some kind of discomfort with that can feel like rejection, both ways around.
Absolutely. And that sensory overload can potentially then spark quite a significant response, right? In terms of fight, flight,
Yeah.
freeze response that might might to a neurotypical person seem really quite extreme in the, but to see and to witness and to know what to do in response to
Yeah.
that.
And those strong kind of preferences for routine or predictability, quite often clash with a relationship, right? And particularly if you take the step into family life, what's often needed in a long-term relationship, particularly where there are children in the mix, is lots of adaptability, lots of flexibility, lots of taking it as it comes. Something's got spilt, somebody's changed their mind, we're now not doing a thing, people have turned up late, people have turned up early, the venue's changed, it's raining, so we're going to move the party indoors, and now it's going to be all of that sort of stuff, which would maybe some people would take in their stride, others, particularly autistic people, would typically not enjoy that kind of uh
I think that's right. But we were talking last time, weren't we, about how with someone with a diagnosis of ADHD might struggle with the routine of kind of married life with kids. That they can love those early parts of the relationship, the dynamic, exciting, romantic early parts of the relationship, but might struggle more with kind of the house in the suburbs and the school run. That there are, although I agree with you, there's a lot of kind of need for thinking on your feet in family life. There is also a large degree of structure and routine. Like lunch boxes need to be made, and netball practice is the same time each week, and et cetera, et cetera. There is a lot of routine in there, but I get what you're saying, kind of day to day.
I agree. I think it's a good challenge. I think we would definitely see the problem the other way around with people who are endlessly flexible and love spontaneity. It's like kids love and need routines, don't they? That's a big aspect of and if you don't impose it, often when I'm talking to couples who are parents, nothing now to do with neurodiversity, what they really suffer from is the absence of predictable routines for themselves, for their adult relationship with their husband, wife, lover, and also the kids are not getting much benefit from it. We don't know whether we're in bed at 7:30 or 8:30, or sometimes it's 9:30, and if the film's good or the football's on, it's later still.
And predictable consequences. I've been talking to you, haven't I, about kind of some struggles with my elder daughter, who, side note, wants to come on the podcast at some point. Reminded me earlier today she wants to come on for a chat. I'm not quite sure how much a 12-year-old knows about romance, but maybe but I think our failure to clarify the predictability of those consequences has got us into some hot water, right? In terms of her expectations and her frustrations when we do intervene and give her a consequence when it feels like it's coming from left field.
Yeah, sure. And I would say that's really common for the couples I work with, particularly, I would say couples who really want to get the craft right, who really give a damn about it and are trying to do the best for their kids. So sometimes it's very, very difficult to upset them or impose a consequence. Even one couple come to mind where I was talking about sanctions, and it ended up feeling like such an old-fashioned kind of word to them, that there would be a sanction or there would be a withdrawal of something. When I was talking about what's going to get withdrawn, what would be the consequence of that? Sanctions, withdrawal with consequences, just the language jarred.
Interesting. So predictability, kind of a difficulty sometimes with change, sensory sensitivity, very deep interest, deep involvement in interests.
Yes, that can be painful too, can't it? That somebody is very good, knowledgeable, informed, will appear to disappear into a rabbit hole, and have a preference for doing that activity rather than spending time in the relationship. I hear that a lot, that the partner is very into a thing, a hobby, sport, craft activity, whatever it might be, just reading, or sometimes it's watching like YouTube videos, not kind of, not crappy ones, sometimes very like technical ones that are deep into a scientific concept or something, and that is baffling and puzzling to the other person. They quite like that. They will have liked that at first, but they don't really like it when they want them to come and sit and watch a show with them. And maybe the autistic person that we're talking about in this scenario has got very little interest and stamina for that activity.
Yeah, like everything that we're going to be bringing up, particularly as we're focusing more on the milder end of the spectrum, it has its strengths, though, right? In a relationship, that you're going to, the idea of your partner going off into a different room for a couple of hours of an evening, freeing yourself up from the expectation that you've got to spend time with them, that you
take the win, right?
When you've got control of the remote control, you can watch what you want to watch. You can speak to your mates. It gives you a sense of freedom that a lot of people want in a relationship, in those moments, at least, that you can share that deep interest to some degree, but you're probably, as a neurotypical person, not going to want to go down quite as deep as your autistic partner, but it frees you up to focus on other interests and activities and maybe get less codependent than some
Yeah,
couples we see.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's a really good point. I was thinking about partnerships sort of extending into one another's friendships or family gatherings or even like work colleagues and stuff. Often we want to show our person off or have them attend
Mm.
yearly thing or a special occasion, and I think those things can be draining and stressful sometimes for people who are neuroatypical, and that can be a strength too, right? Because you can come for a bit, like that can be okay, like we can negotiate and trade on this, we can get to better understand one another. I think a great virtue can be made of that if we can articulate from each side what it is we want, what's disappointing us, why we felt let down or
Yeah.
hurt by that thing, or why it is so exhausting for us, rather than that we're wrong or that we're very sorry about a thing. If we could just say what it is we wanted and why we're feeling a particular way, I think it's often the thing that unlocks a lot of what's problematic in relationships, leaving aside the question of autism, ADHD, or any other, condition diagnosed or not.
I think you've focused there on one of the big, I guess, themes or recommendations for
Mm.
couples where one partner is autistic is around clarity of communication. We would say that, wouldn't we, to any couple
Yeah,
around
yeah,
don't assume your partner is a mind reader. Ask for what you want, make it explicit. But that is 10 times the case in a couple with
yeah,
one autistic
yeah,
member. In
yeah. I agree.
I was listening to someone, a guy with autism, who was talking about his relationship and how for months his partner, his girlfriend, was doing the dishes after dinner, right? And one day she came to him and said, "Why don't you ever offer to help?" And he had genuinely never even considered,
Yeah, yeah,
genuinely never even thought about it. Hadn't kind of deliberately avoided it. Felt awful
yeah,
that he found out that this was important to her and this is something that was expected of him and he should step up and do. Felt terrible about it, really guilty. And from that day, committed to do it and committed to
yeah,
help, right? But
yeah,
that lack of, for someone like you and me, we would just, there'd be an expectation of some sort of
yeah,
shared endeavor there, right? That those social cues or those social expectations, and certainly the implicit communication, the passive aggressive slamming down of a plate because you're pissed off that your partner isn't helping out,
yeah.
isn't going to get picked up in quite the same.
No. It's one of the joys of the work, I think, because you're doing exactly what you're describing there. You're inviting that couple to be really explicit about the communication, and it's sort of, I think it's helped me in my couples work more generally, because you've got to be clear as the therapist. You've got to keep your interventions, your questions, any kind of prompts or reflections back short and sweet and to the point and on track. They can't be like multi-clause. I can't do the rambly long sentences like this one. It's got to be crisp. It's got to be direct. And I think what I'm trying to draw out mostly for couples is, let's be explicit about what we want. Let's start talking about it, not for hours. That's the opposite of what I would suggest, but just a quick, like, I didn't like that. I would prefer this. I'd appreciate it if, when you do that, tends to make me feel like this. Those things which can be dealt with quickly and are usually reasonably well received. I didn't know that. I don't want to make you feel like that. That wasn't my intention. If I did this slightly differently, would that work any better? Those are the sort of communications that I value in my relationship and seem to work for the couples that I see. It's not the only thing. It's a bit sort of skills based, isn't it? But I think it's often the unlock. We
Yes.
can work out why we're like we are and why we've got this pattern. And very often the people I'm working with are interested in, how this came about from their family of origin and all of those sorts of things. But even that insight, useful, interesting as it is, unless you do something with it, not as useful as you first think. You've still got to do the
Yep.
skill differently. And I think that's the bit I quite like getting to quickly. And I think with with an autistic client, you've got to get there because nothing else is going to work in my experience.
Nothing else is going to work. Exactly. It doesn't matter if you say every time I huff and puff, that means that I'm pissed off that you're not helping. It's like, no, no, no. You've got to actually say,
Yeah, right.
Every time we do the dishes, I want you to help, or 50% of the time, I want you to do it. It's got to be much
Yeah,
more explicit. No implied body language, no kind of,
yeah,
no verbal cues. It's got to be direct
yeah.
communication.
Yeah. And that's a sort of phrase I would say to a lot of couples. I mean, any couple really, when you're upset, say, I'm upset because, and have your best go at it. You might want to formulate it in your head first so it comes out in a reasonably concise way and it's not too accusatory. But if you're feeling it, you probably are somewhere near being able to identify the why, or it can be a discussion, or if you
Mm,
know it, it can be said quite quickly. But if you're feeling upset, you'd say, "I'm upset because," right?
mm,
That would be a really useful thing to do in a relationship. And I'm always surprised by super smart people not being able to do those things very easily with their other person, and
yeah.
that's often the prescription. That's often what I'm saying, that kind of thing. I think with autistic people, you're doing some of the other things that you and I are fond of that couples don't always love, like scheduling intimacy, for example. So making it clear when we're at least going to set the conditions for having sex. Like, we don't have to have it. Like, we could do something less than that. We could cuddle, we could end up chatting something through and have a nice time together. It could be intimate without necessarily being sexual, but we would have a time where, like, there's at least an option for that. And lots of couples find that dreadfully unromantic and feels like a disappointment or a failure. And it always used to be so free and easy, and we never used to have to think about these things. I think for autistic people, that kind of scheduling is much more, it feels much more intuitive, sensible, sane, unquestionably a good idea.
Good. There's presumably an overlap between two of those things that you've mentioned. One around predictability, one around, or at least two or three of them, predictability, but something about sensory and physical
Yeah,
touch sensitivity, but also kind of clarity of communication.
yeah,
Something around
yeah,
with a neurotypical person, there might be something about managing expectations around
yeah,
sexual connection
yeah.
and making things more explicit and
Yeah,
have
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
a
exactly. So,
pace that you're not fully comfortable with, or that maybe you'd want something a bit more,
yeah,
as you say, a bit more dynamic or a bit more intuitive, a bit more
yeah.
unpredictable.
Yeah, and just because, like, there's no rules for us to give on this, are there? There aren't any universal rules. So I mean, I'm working with a couple where one person is would identify themselves as an autistic person, and they would say they like hugs, but they don't like hugs when they're at their desk working. That isn't a welcome and cutesy thing. That isn't a lovely interruption or a moment where punctuate a kind of dull work day, or it's irritating. It breaks their focus. But it doesn't mean they don't like hugs or they don't like touch. They do like those things, but they like it in certain circumstances. So that bit just needs to get articulated, and some of the reasoning around that can be, I think, fairly readily understood by the other person. But if we were just repeating well, when I go to touch them, they recoil or they do whatever, it will be a moment of puzzlement because the other person will say, "No, I don't. I like that." And they'll be like,
Yeah,
"You didn't the other day because this happened."
yeah,
And then we'll work out, oh, it's at the desk. There's a desk thing, there's a work thing, there's a boundary between, professional and private or personal, or they have more of a click into sort of professional to personal to passionate, or however you
mm,
might see that thing. Whereas other people might be more fluid about that,
yeah,
or might deal with it differently. But as in all things, relationships, I don't think there's good or bad or right or wrong or even preferable. It's just your preference and my preference, and we have to work that through, aren't we? We're going to have to talk about that and try and understand one another's preference and come to compromise or take it in turns, or frankly put up with it sometimes.
mm, mm. And a lot of the people, neurotypical people we would see in those couples are not practiced or skilled in talking about sex, right? Talking about what they
Yeah,
want,
no
talk.
one is, are they really? I mean,
Is.
I don't meet anyone who's any good at doing that.
But there's also something you're touching on there, which is around expectations, in terms of it can feel like a failure to have to talk about it, to put it together like a job that you've got.
Never used to have to talk about it, did we, when we were in our 20s, or, that kind of thing would be like what I get a lot. It used
Yeah,
to be so natural and so instinctive, and we couldn't keep our hands off one another and we couldn't
yeah,
get enough of it, and it was the best ever. And now it's, you know, sometimes sort of lying dead in the corner.
yeah, yeah. One of the I think one of the myths around autism that you just kind of popped was around desire for physical touch. I think that there's, because of that sensory sensitivity, there can be a myth around not wanting physical touch. So one of the other key myths is around empathy, is around
Yeah.
feeling big feelings and being able to connect with your partner's feelings, but needing a kind of entry point, needing a ramp up to understand what's going on for that person. And that is about communication, right? Again, rather than intuiting from
Yeah.
facial expressions and body language how someone's feeling, quite literally, sometimes someone's, for example, crying. It might be difficult for someone to understand why their partner is crying
Yeah.
and might need that explained. And once that's explained, particularly for someone with a more kind of moderate to severe end of the spectrum for autism, that can then evoke the very, very strong empathetic response.
Yeah. I think that the idea that autistic people don't feel is fairly readily disprovable, and has been thoroughly disproven. How they express those feelings, and how different that might be to others in a general population. That's the bit that's noteworthy and that's interesting. But I think in every couple, you are dealing with some variant of that. Like, I will watch something with my wife and I'll comment on the central theme, and she'll say, "Oh, I didn't really spot that," and she'll tell me what she thought the central theme was. There is that, like, we're going to need to talk about this, and it can be infuriating. It's like, why on earth did you not see the central theme in exactly the same way I did? But we're going to need to unpack it and start talking about why. And that can be interesting, that can be valuable, that can be enriching. It's often the reason we've chosen our partner, because they represent something different from us, something that's a bit underdeveloped in us, or something that we're
Mm,
just no good at, or
that's nice. That's nice.
that we like but we can't easily do. Lots of
Mm.
planners are with people who are more spontaneous, and the spontaneous people have got lots of red bills and parking tickets.
This is where we start talking about your aborted attempts to be a script writer, Matt. Into the mix.
That's got to be another
That's
podcast.
gonna be another podcast. Okay. Okay.
I was thinking also about things like sort of the social admin, of a
Mm.
relationship, particularly in family life, that would go on with a neurotypical person and somebody who identified as an autistic person, where the neurotypical person might ordinarily pick up more of that hosting, family events, networking, and something about naming the imbalance as well, which I think is important
Yes.
in any relationship. So it may well be that it's skewed. There's lots of tasks that are skewed in our house in some ways that you might predict and some ways that you probably wouldn't.
Well, you mentioned earlier about the kind of social who takes the
Right.
lead. If you're hosting, right? Yeah, your wife will take the lead on being at the front door to welcome people in, and
Yeah.
you might dive upstairs.
I usually do that bit because you can welcome them in, and then you've done it. You've been seen, and I'll get the coats. It could take me a long while to get those coats and
Never
drinks.
got up
Yeah.
during the evening, and there you are, just squirreled away upstairs with a whiskey on your own.
But I think naming that thing
Yeah,
is critical in it's really important in my relationship. I think it's kind of close to critical
yeah,
in lots of relationships, and it probably is literally critical in the kind of relationships we're talking about with somebody
yes, definitely.
who, particularly somebody who is identifying themselves as an autistic person. And like that it's worth saying as well, isn't it? Like, I really like that thing about you, and I appreciate those things. So for me, like, my wife wanting to host and be sociable, it is a strain on me, and I do get exhausted at the end of it. But I like seeing people, and I like seeing her in her element, and I like us being sociable, and I like her exampling that to the boys and all of those sorts of things. There's something to really like and welcome about it. It's the
Mm,
very, it is the point of our coupling together and being together, and but it needs to be said, I think, and it needs to be understood. And it's been much easier since she's understood that those things have a sort of a cost, to me, rather than I'm just like a grumpy bastard,
mm.
which may
And
also
that
be true.
cost has a consequence that she needs to help you carve out time for as well, in the sense of quiet time, downtime, the next day being a bit.
Yeah, I think less so for me.
Yeah,
It's sort of, once it's done, it's done.
yeah,
Maybe a little bit of downtime. But I think in the
yeah,
relationships we're talking about, where
yeah,
somebody's got a more pronounced condition that they're working with, they're trying to be in a relationship with somebody, trying to make time for family gatherings and all of
yeah.
the things that often go with a relationship, they might need downtime, mightn't they? They might need a break. They might need to be around for a while and then disappear. They might need to go out for a walk between
Mm.
courses. They might need to, do something that just sort of breaks that, or, is a circuit breaker on those things, or is an offset, something along those lines.
Well, one thing we haven't talked much about tonight is masking, and I guess
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
relevant to what you're talking about there, is that that masking those kind of more autistic tendencies and putting on a more socially acceptable face has energy consequences, doesn't it? You're going to be
yeah,
knackered. It
agree.
takes
Yeah,
effort and thought and constant scanning to do it. And if you are
yeah,
someone who really very much struggles with social interaction, has to concentrate to, for example, maintain eye contact, to really try and work out what someone is trying to tell you implicitly. That's a lot of work, really hard work, that
yeah, yeah, agree.
probably has consequences in terms of you're going to be knackered at the end of that. You're going to have to manage how much time you're committing to that. And you need your partner to understand that that's who you are, and to not only tolerate that, but to look out for you almost, and to make sure that they're
Yeah.
helping you to manage that.
Yeah, I agree. I like, and not to contradict what you're saying, but I like the example you gave earlier where you were talking about a person who wasn't aware of the request from the other person to help with the dishes or whatever it might be. I had a couple very much in that sort of mold, where she would find it a real struggle to ask for she didn't drive, and to ask for lifts to places, to be taken to pick something up, or to see a friend, or to shop on a particular neighborhood, and was wanting husband to guess, and thought that that was obvious, and all of those sorts of things. And as soon as the request is made, delighted to do it. Actually a super helpful guy, who had a really strong value of help and service and all of those sorts of thing. So no, not to contradict what you're saying, but I think sometimes when the request is out there, it's like that can get met more easily. Like, not everything is exhausting, not everything is a rub. Sometimes
Yeah.
that clear comms is
No, no, no. I was
positive
thinking
reinforcement, isn't it?
absolutely, and like that case study on doing the dishes, like more than happy, kind of very willing to step in and do it, and not just from a place of guilt, but from a place, as you said, of service, of wanting to prove that they care about their partner and care about their partner's wishes, for sure.
Yeah. And I was thinking of sort of another kind of silly example, then maybe we should stop, but it's sort of like, thanks for making eye contact. I really appreciated that. Well,
Yep.
thanks for asking me about my day. And I think we can
Yep.
all be coached in those ways. I find that an ongoing thing in my relationship. I hadn't realized how much my wife really likes those things. I hadn't realized what matters, to my partner in some important respects, like how important that thing is, how significant that is for her. So I think those things are revealing themselves often in relationships, time and time and time again. And the things we thought we knew about somebody, we knew, but maybe only to an extent, or we didn't fully realize. So it's a bit of a humdrum conclusion, isn't it, to say that the challenges are the same in all relationships. I don't think they are, but I think they're of the same type. The things that we're talking about: explicit communication, kind of kindness and patience and
Well, I think
tolerance for the other person's point of view.
I think that's spot on. While we've been talking, I think the challenge is almost in a relationship with one autistic person and a neurotypical person,
Mm.
are almost like they're exactly the same challenges as with two neurotypical people, same skills that neurotypical couples come to people like us to help them with, because they're so hard. They're simple, but they're really hard.
Yeah, I agree.
And so it's even more important and more, in some ways, more challenging for a couple where there is an autistic partner. It's in some ways going to be harder. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
appreciate the strengths in those relationships, but to kind of make communication explicit, to deal
yeah,
with sensory
yeah,
difficulties, to
yeah,
to tolerate and to cherish really, really deep and passionate interests, for example,
yeah,
that all of those skills are equivalent skills for a neurotypical couple,
yeah.
but almost doubly important where when there's an autistic person involved.
Yeah. And again, I guess just the slight counter to that is I have found those people like very teachable, very like
Sure.
thirsty, keen to learn, and because they've been sort of fitting in with like
Yeah.
societal norms a lot, they kind of get that they need to do it in certain circumstances. Not to say it doesn't piss them off sometimes, and doesn't deplete energy, but they sort of know the game. It's like, okay, you've just told me the rule. I didn't realize
That's
it was
interesting.
like the last defender,
Yeah.
the ball being played. I hadn't realized, like, if you play from your inside your own half, it's different. Oh, right, okay, I've got that now.
I was waiting for the one per episode football analogy, Matt. I was waiting for it. Came right at the end, but I knew it was going to be in there somewhere. I think just to really embellish that point and to reinforce it, I think sometimes when we talk to neurotypical couples, they're almost taken aback and slightly affronted that they have
Yeah,
to do
I've got,
something
yeah, I
new.
agree. Yeah,
I have to actually make this explicit. I have to
yeah,
actually
yeah.
ask for what I want to. That's ridiculous. I should just be intuited, and my partner should know exactly what I want.
Yeah, that was
So,
exactly the point I was going to make. I think for some couples, it feels like, oh, this is offensive. It's either so simple, or it's like we've been together for a decade, longer often, or even if we've been together 2 years, we feel like, why should I be having to do these things? Surely nobody else does these things. Whereas I think there's a much more, this is a bit crude, stereotypical, but I think there's much more willingness and acceptance amongst autistic people that there is going to be a need to, whether you call it mask, fit in, or just get your needs met in some way, or meet the needs of your partner in a way that chimes with them. Whereas I think, couples do really struggle with that. A lot of the work I'm doing is saying you really are going to do that. Like, they do not know you in the way that you think. If what you think
mm,
is, they should be able to read your mind, or just assume or know what your preference is, because you once said you didn't particularly like that thing. It's not as clear, it's not as explicit, and it's not a point of view that everybody shares.
good. Any last thoughts? Or are we
No,
done?
no, I think that will probably that probably does it, doesn't it?
I think so. Any questions, any comments? I think this is probably the end of our very short mini series on neurodiversity, Matt, isn't it? I don't think that.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to it. We should thread it through, though, shouldn't we?
Yeah,
Because
oh,
we
of
we
course.
both see a lot of that in our work, and even though the numbers feel a bit, kind of 800-fold increases feel a bit
Yeah,
bulky,
and I don't think
there's something going on, isn't there? There's an increased
yeah.
awareness, and it's a real part of life. And I think lots of people who even skeptical of things as firm as diagnosis understand that there is something that's worth picking up on, something that's worth thinking seriously about and dealing respectfully with. I think it unlocks quite a lot. I mean, I'm not pushing anybody into diagnosis or anything like that, but I do think an understanding of that and a sort of basic framework, really, it helps in my work, it helps in my life, and I see that for others as well.
I agree. All right. Take care. I'll see you soon.